The loudest person in the room isn't always the one everyone fears. Sometimes it's the one who hasn't stood up yet. I never imagined a charity gala could smell like fresh lilies, expensive perfume, and quiet desperation all at once. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors, while a string quartet played softly in the corner, creating the kind of evening people dreamed about when they imagined New York's elite. I was only there because I needed the extra shift. My black server's uniform had been pressed 3 times that afternoon, and I kept reminding myself that if I smiled enough, kept my tray steady, and avoided drawing attention, the tips from one night could cover almost half my rent. That was all that mattered. At least, that was what I believed until everything changed. My name is Emily Carter, and at 26 years old, I had learned that invisible people survived longer. Invisible waitresses didn't interrupt conversations worth billions of dollars. Invisible women didn't make headlines. Invisible women quietly refilled champagne glasses, apologized even when nothing was their fault, and disappeared before anyone remembered their faces. That plan worked perfectly for almost 3 hours. Then table 14 asked for another bottle of champagne just as someone behind me stepped backward without looking. My shoulder bumped lightly against his arm. The tray tilted. One glass slipped. It didn't shatter. It barely splashed a few drops of sparkling wine across the sleeve of an expensive tuxedo. Silence arrived before I could even apologize. Every nearby conversation stopped as if someone had muted the room. "I'm so sorry," I said immediately, reaching for a clean linen napkin. "It was an accident." The man looked at the tiny droplets on his jacket as though they were permanent stains. His expression hardened. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" His voice echoed far louder than it needed to. Heat rushed into my face. "I'll notify my manager. We'll pay for the cleaning." My hands trembled, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. That should have ended it. Instead, he brushed my hand away so abruptly that the folded napkin fell onto the marble floor. The movement wasn't enough to injure me, but it was enough to make me lose my balance for a second. A few guests looked away. Others pretended to study the paintings hanging along the walls. No one spoke. Embarrassment spread through me much faster than fear. Somehow standing there while strangers watched without saying a word hurt more than the mistake itself. "People like you always ruin important evenings," he muttered, shaking his head with open contempt. I bent down to retrieve the napkin because I needed something to do besides let everyone see the tears threatening to form. My fingers had barely touched the fabric when I heard laughter from another nearby table. Not cruel laughter, nervous laughter. The kind people use when they're relieved the humiliation belongs to someone else. I swallowed hard and reminded myself that I needed this job. Rent was due in 4 days. My younger brother's community college tuition payment was scheduled next week. Pride didn't pay utility bills. I slowly stood again, whispered another apology, and prepared to walk away before things became even worse. Then something unusual happened. The music stopped in the middle of a song. I didn't know why. I only noticed that every pair of eyes suddenly shifted toward the back of the ballroom. I followed their gaze without thinking. At the last table, far from the spotlight, a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit quietly placed his whiskey glass onto the table. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. He simply rose to his feet. And somehow hundreds of people forgot to breathe. No one announced his name. No one had to. The silence that spread across the ballroom carried more authority than any introduction ever could. I watched the man straighten the front of his charcoal suit with calm, unhurried movements, as though the entire evening belonged to him. He looked to be in his mid-30s, tall, composed, with dark hair neatly swept back and sharp features that revealed nothing. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way every security guard subtly adjusted their posture that made my heartbeat quicken. Even the servers beside me stopped moving. I heard someone whisper behind me, barely louder than a breath. "That is Adrian Moretti." Another voice answered immediately. "Keep your eyes down." I had never met him before. I only knew the rumors people exchanged in break rooms and late-night subway rides. Powerful businessman, private investor, philanthropist, A man whose donations quietly kept hospitals, shelters, and scholarship programs alive. Other rumors painted a much darker picture, but rumors were easy to invent about wealthy men. What I knew for certain was the effect he had on the room. Conversations dissolved. Laughter disappeared. Even the man who had embarrassed me moments earlier seemed unsure whether he should speak again. Adrian began walking toward us. His polished shoes barely made a sound against the marble floor. Every step was measured, almost relaxed, yet it somehow felt impossible to ignore. He did not glance at the guests trying to greet him. He did not acknowledge the executives who stepped aside to make room. His attention remained fixed on a single point. Me. I suddenly became aware of the sting in my eyes, the uneven rhythm of my breathing, and the napkin still clutched tightly in my hand. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I stood perfectly still. Adrian stopped several feet away from us. His gaze shifted briefly to the champagne stain that had nearly vanished from the expensive tuxedo, then toward the napkin in my hand, and finally rested on my face. There was no anger in his expression, no pity either, only careful observation, as though he were assembling a puzzle no one else realized existed. The businessman forced a smile that looked painfully rehearsed. "Mr. Moretti, this is nothing. Just an unfortunate misunderstanding." Adrian remained silent for another few seconds. The quiet stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. I realized something then. Powerful people often filled silence with explanations because silence itself frightened them. Adrian clearly was not one of those people. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Was anyone injured?" The question caught everyone off guard. The businessman laughed awkwardly. "Of course not. It was only spilled champagne." Adrian nodded once, almost thoughtfully. "Then why?" he asked with complete calm. "Does she look like the only person here being asked to carry the entire weight of this accident?" No one answered. My manager opened his mouth before immediately closing it again. The guests exchanged uncertain glances. Somewhere behind me, a champagne cork popped from another table, startling everyone because the room had become so impossibly quiet. Adrian looked toward me again. "Miss," he said gently, "did anyone ask whether you were all right?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The truth was painfully simple. No one had. They had only looked at the stain. No one had looked at me. The question lingered in the air longer than anyone seemed prepared to endure. Did anyone ask whether I was all right? I lowered my eyes because answering honestly felt strangely more difficult than apologizing had been. My silence became the answer. Adrian Moretti studied my expression for a brief moment, then shifted his attention toward the businessman standing a few feet away. The expensive tuxedo no longer seemed important. Neither did the champagne stain that had caused the entire scene. What mattered now was something far less visible. Respect. The businessman forced another uneasy smile and cleared his throat. "Mr. Moretti, I believe this has been misunderstood. Everyone here knows these events can become stressful. Emotions simply got ahead of good judgment." Adrian did not interrupt him. He listened with the same calm expression that had never changed since leaving his table. That almost frightened me more than anger would have. When the man finally stopped talking, Adrian glanced around the ballroom. Hundreds of guests stood frozen beneath glittering chandeliers, pretending not to stare while missing absolutely nothing. "Interesting," Adrian said quietly. "A room filled with successful people. Yet no one remembered the simplest rule." His voice remained almost conversational. "Character is revealed by how you treat someone who cannot improve your position." No one responded. My manager shifted nervously beside me, twisting the edge of his jacket between trembling fingers. I could tell he wanted to apologize to everyone at once, but he could not decide where to begin. Adrian turned toward him instead. "How long has she worked here?" My manager blinked in surprise. "Almost 3 years, sir." "Has she ever caused trouble?" "Never." "Has she ever received complaints from guests?" "No, sir. Quite the opposite. She is one of our most dependable employees." Adrian nodded once. "Then tonight should not define her." The words landed gently, yet they seemed to echo throughout the ballroom. I felt my throat tighten. 3 years of arriving early, covering extra shifts, skipping holidays, and smiling through exhaustion had been reduced to a single embarrassing moment. Until now. For the first time that evening, someone had looked beyond the accident. The businessman attempted one final laugh. Surely we can move forward. There is no reason for anyone to make this into something larger. Adrian slowly faced him again. You are correct, he answered. There is no reason to make it larger. Relief briefly crossed the man's face. Then Adrian added, which is exactly why it should have ended with her first apology. The relief vanished instantly. Across the ballroom, several executives quietly lowered their glasses. A woman near the stage gently placed her purse back onto her chair after apparently deciding not to leave just yet. Everyone sensed the evening had shifted in a direction no one expected. Adrian stepped closer, never invading anyone's space, never raising his voice. An honest mistake deserves understanding, he said. Public humiliation is a choice. The sentence settled over the room with undeniable weight. I noticed the businessman searching the faces around him, expecting someone to support him. No one did. Even the colleagues who had stood beside him only minutes earlier avoided his eyes. It amazed me how quickly confidence disappeared when respect quietly walked away. Adrian looked back at me one final time. Miss Carter, he said, speaking my name with surprising familiarity. You have nothing to apologize for anymore. I stared at him, completely forgetting to breathe, because I had never told him my name. For a second, I wondered whether I had heard him correctly. Miss Carter. My name sounded unfamiliar coming from someone I had never met. I searched my memory, convinced we must have crossed paths before, but nothing came back. Adrian seemed to notice the confusion in my eyes, yet he offered no explanation. He simply looked toward the businessman once more with the same impossible calm that had unsettled everyone since he had entered the conversation. There is one more thing, he said quietly. Every apology has 2 parts, admitting the mistake and repairing the dignity that was taken with it. The businessman shifted his weight and forced another polite smile. I have already accepted that this situation became unfortunate. Adrian tilted his head ever so slightly. That was not what I said. Around us, I could hear nothing except the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of silverware from the hotel kitchen. Even the musicians remained perfectly still, their instruments resting silently in their hands. The ballroom had become a courtroom without a judge, and somehow Adrian did not need to raise his voice to command it. The businessman glanced toward several influential guests as if searching for support. One by one, they avoided his eyes. A woman who had been standing beside him quietly stepped away. Another executive suddenly became very interested in checking messages on his phone. It was astonishing how quickly confidence disappeared when nobody chose to stand beside it. Adrian spoke again. You embarrassed someone who could not answer you without risking her livelihood. That is not strength. That is convenience. His words were measured, almost gentle, but every sentence carried undeniable weight. The businessman inhaled slowly before turning toward me. I could tell the apology forming on his lips was not something he wanted to give. His pride fought against it until finally reality won. Miss Carter, he said stiffly. I overreacted. I should not have spoken to you that way. I apologize. I blinked in surprise. It was not a warm apology. It was not heartfelt. But it existed, and only minutes earlier I would have believed such a moment impossible. Adrian gave a single nod, neither satisfied nor disappointed. Better, he replied. Now remember it the next time someone makes an honest mistake. No threats followed. No dramatic confrontation. Nothing happened except a simple conversation. Yet the atmosphere inside the ballroom had completely transformed. My manager hurried toward me carrying a fresh serving tray. His voice shook with embarrassment. Emily, why do not you take a 15-minute break? I should have stepped in sooner. I am sorry. I looked at him almost speechless. In 3 years, I had never heard him apologize to an employee. Before I could answer, Adrian addressed him without taking his eyes off me. She has been standing for hours. Make it 30 minutes. And send someone to bring her dinner while it is still warm. Of course, my manager answered immediately. Right away. I stared at Adrian, unable to understand why a man surrounded by influence and wealth seemed more concerned about whether I had eaten than about the expensive gala unfolding around him. For the first time since the evening began, I noticed something different behind his composed expression. It was not triumph. It was relief, as though making certain I was treated with simple human dignity had resolved something far more important than spilled champagne. Then his phone vibrated once inside his jacket. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time that night, the calm in his eyes hardened ever so slightly. Whatever message had just arrived, I knew the evening was far from over. The ballroom slowly came back to life, but nothing felt the same anymore. Conversations resumed in cautious whispers instead of confident laughter. Glasses clinked again. The quartet carefully picked up the melody they had abandoned, and servers returned to weaving between tables with practiced smiles. Yet every time I looked up, I caught someone glancing in my direction before quickly pretending they had not been watching. 30 minutes earlier I had been invisible. Now I wished I could disappear again. My manager led me through a quiet hallway beside the main ballroom into a private staff dining room normally reserved for event coordinators. A warm plate of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread already waited on the table. Beside it sat a cup of hot tea instead of coffee. Take your time, my manager said softly. Your shift can wait. After he closed the door behind him, I simply stared at the meal. Nobody had ever paused an event because a waitress needed to eat. I wrapped both hands around the warm teacup, letting the heat calm the trembling that still lingered in my fingers. The first sip barely reached my throat before there was a gentle knock at the door. I expected another supervisor. Instead, a woman in an elegant navy business suit stepped inside carrying a small white medical kit. Miss Carter, she said with a kind smile. Mr. Moretti asked me to check whether your hand needs attention. I looked down, confused, until I noticed the tiny cut near my thumb where the broken champagne glass had scraped my skin earlier. I had forgotten it completely. It is only a scratch, I answered. Probably, she agreed while opening the kit. But he noticed you winced when you picked up the napkin. Her words caught me off guard. I had not realized anyone had been paying attention that closely. She carefully cleaned the tiny cut and placed a simple adhesive bandage over it. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. There, she said warmly. You should be fine. Please thank Mr. Moretti for me, I replied. She smiled again. You can thank him yourself. Before I could ask what she meant, she stepped aside as Adrian quietly entered the room. Without the crowd surrounding him, he somehow looked even calmer. He had removed his tuxedo jacket, leaving only a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves neatly buttoned at his wrists. He remained near the doorway instead of walking closer, respecting the distance between us. I hope they finally gave you dinner, he said. I nodded. Yes, thank you. Good. His answer was simple, almost absent-minded, as though making certain someone had eaten was the most ordinary thing in the world. I hesitated before asking the question that had been circling through my mind since the ballroom. How did you know my name? A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. The event roster lists every employee working tonight, he answered. I make it a habit to know the names of the people who keep evenings like this running. I blinked, unsure whether to believe that explanation. It sounded reasonable, yet something about the way he studied me suggested there was more he was choosing not to say. His phone vibrated again. This time he silenced it without looking at the screen. You should finish your dinner while it is still warm, he said. The night is not over yet. Before I could respond, another knock echoed through the room. The woman in the navy suit stepped back inside, her calm expression replaced by quiet concern. She looked directly at Adrian. Sir, she said carefully, someone unexpected has just arrived asking for Miss Carter by name. The room seemed to lose its warmth the moment those words were spoken. Someone unexpected has just arrived asking for Miss Carter by name. I looked from the woman in the navy suit to Adrian, hoping one of them would explain what was happening. Neither did. Adrian's expression remained composed, but something subtle changed in his eyes. The quiet ease that had surrounded him only seconds earlier disappeared, replaced by sharp attention. "Who is it?" he asked. "He would only identify himself as Daniel Brooks," the woman replied. "He insists he knows Miss Carter personally." My stomach tightened immediately. Daniel, my former supervisor from a restaurant where I had worked 2 years earlier. We had not spoken in months. He knew I had left because the late hours made it impossible to balance school and work. Why would he come here tonight? "I know him," I said carefully. "At least I used to." Adrian looked toward me. "Do you expect him?" I shook my head. No, that single word seemed to answer more than I intended. Adrian remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "Ask security to invite him into the private reception lounge. Offer him coffee. Tell them Miss Carter will be there shortly." The woman nodded and quietly left the room. I frowned in confusion. Why not let him come here? Adrian met my eyes without hesitation. Because if someone unexpectedly asks for a person by name during an event this size, I prefer to understand why before placing unnecessary pressure on either of you. His explanation sounded perfectly reasonable, yet I noticed he never said he distrusted Daniel. He simply preferred certainty over assumptions. It was the kind of answer only someone accustomed to solving problems before they appeared would give. I looked down at my untouched dinner. Somehow I had lost my appetite again. Adrian noticed. "Eat another bite," he said calmly. "People think more clearly when they are not hungry." I almost laughed despite everything. "You always sound certain." "No," he answered. "I simply prepare for more possibilities than most people." I picked up my fork and forced myself to eat a few more bites while he stood quietly near the window overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Thousands of lights stretched across the city below us, each one representing another story unfolding somewhere beyond the hotel walls. "Do you always notice everything?" I finally asked. He smiled faintly without turning around. "No, I miss many things." "Then why notice me?" The question escaped before I could stop it. He remained silent long enough that I wondered whether he intended to answer at all. Finally he spoke. "Because everyone else was watching the mistake. You were the only one worried about everyone except yourself." His words settled gently into the quiet room. I remembered apologizing to the guests, worrying about my manager, worrying about my job, worrying about next month's rent. I had never stopped to wonder whether anyone might notice how frightened I actually felt. Adrian turned back toward me. "Kind people often assume they must carry every uncomfortable moment alone," he said softly. "That is rarely true." Before I could respond, the woman in the navy suit returned once more. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice, "Mr. Brooks is waiting in the reception lounge." She hesitated before adding, "There is something else. He told security he came because someone paid him to deliver a message directly to Miss Carter, and he refuses to leave until she hears it herself." My heartbeat became louder with every step toward the private reception lounge. Adrian walked beside me without saying a word, his pace unhurried, his attention quietly scanning the hallway as though he noticed details everyone else ignored. The woman in the navy suit remained several feet behind us, giving us space while still staying close enough to help if needed. I kept replaying Daniel's name in my mind. We had parted on good terms. He had even written me a recommendation when I left the restaurant. None of it explained why someone would pay him to find me tonight. The reception lounge overlooked the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. Warm lamps replaced the bright lights of the ballroom, making the room feel almost peaceful despite the knot tightening in my stomach. Daniel stood as soon as I entered. He looked exactly as I remembered. A little older, a little more tired, still wearing the same kind expression that had made him everyone's favorite manager years ago. "Emily," he said with visible relief. "Thank goodness you came." "Daniel, what is going on?" I asked. His eyes shifted briefly toward Adrian before returning to me. "I was told to give this to you." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small cream-colored envelope with my name written neatly across the front. Who gave it to you? I asked. Daniel shook his head. I honestly do not know. A woman approached me outside my office this afternoon. She knew where you were working tonight. She offered me $500 just to make sure this reached you in person. Adrian remained completely silent, but I noticed him studying the envelope rather than the messenger. Daniel continued almost apologetically. I almost refused, but she knew things about you. She knew your schedule, your old workplace, even that your younger brother had started community college this year. She said the message was important, not dangerous. My fingers hesitated before taking the envelope. It felt surprisingly light. I carefully opened it and unfolded a single sheet of paper. There were only 2 typed sentences. Thank you for choosing kindness 3 years ago. Someone has finally come to repay that debt. No signature. No explanation. Just those 2 lines. I read them twice before looking up in confusion. I do not understand. Daniel frowned. 3 years ago? I searched my memory. Hundreds of customers. Thousands of conversations. Nothing stood out. Adrian finally spoke, his voice as calm as ever. Think about someone who could never repay you at the time. I closed my eyes for a moment. Faces drifted through my memory until one suddenly stopped me. An elderly homeless veteran who had come into the restaurant just before closing during a winter snowstorm. He had quietly asked if he could warm up for a few minutes because the buses had stopped running. Company policy said we were supposed to ask non-customers to leave. Instead, I had bought him a bowl of soup with my own tip money and packed leftovers for him to take. I had forgotten about it completely. It cannot be, I whispered. Adrian watched my expression carefully. Small acts rarely feel small to the person receiving them. Before I could answer, Daniel reached into his pocket one final time. There was one more thing, he said softly. The woman told me that if you remembered the man with the soup, I should also tell you this. He paused, looking directly at me. She said that tonight was never about spilled champagne. It was about making sure someone finally found the woman they had been searching for. The words echoed through my mind long after Daniel fell silent. They had been searching for me. Not because of the accident tonight. Not because of the gala. Because of something I had done years ago and completely forgotten. I looked down at the letter again, tracing the neat black print with my eyes as though another answer might suddenly appear between the lines. Nothing changed. It remained 2 simple sentences carrying a weight I could not explain. Daniel gave me an apologetic smile. That is everything they asked me to deliver. I wish I knew more. I nodded slowly. You have already helped more than you realize. He shook my hand, wished me well, and quietly left the reception lounge. The door closed behind him, leaving only Adrian and me standing in the warm silence of the room. Manhattan shimmered outside the windows, thousands of lights stretching into the distance like stars resting on the earth. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Do you know who sent this? I finally asked. Adrian did not answer immediately. He walked toward the window and rested one hand lightly against the back of a chair. I know enough to believe it was sent with good intentions, he replied. But I do not know the name. Something about his answer felt completely honest, yet incomplete. He seemed like a man who revealed only the part of the truth that belonged to him. You are not surprised, I said quietly. A faint smile crossed his face. Kindness has a habit of traveling farther than people expect. I looked at him for a long moment before asking the question that had been growing louder inside my mind all evening. Was tonight really just a coincidence? Adrian turned toward me. The expression in his eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. I attended this gala because my foundation sponsors several scholarship programs. He paused before continuing. Meeting you was not part of my plans. I believed him. At least I believed that part. Before either of us spoke again, another gentle knock sounded at the door. The woman in the navy suit stepped inside carrying a tablet. Sir, she said respectfully, the guest who caused the disturbance earlier has requested to leave the event. Adrian nodded. Thank him for attending. Wish him a safe evening. She hesitated. There is one more matter. Several board members have asked whether Miss Carter would still be comfortable finishing her shift. They are concerned she may feel uneasy after everything that happened. I opened my mouth to answer, but Adrian spoke first. The decision belongs entirely to Miss Carter. No pressure, no expectation, just a simple reminder that the choice was finally mine. I took a slow breath. Only a few hours earlier I would have forced myself back onto the ballroom floor because I believed I had no alternative. Now, for the first time that night, I realized someone had given me something much more valuable than protection. They had given me the freedom to choose. I will finish my shift, I said. Not because I have to, because I want this evening to end on my terms. Adrian gave a quiet nod that almost looked like approval. That, he said softly, is exactly the answer I hoped you would give. As we walked back toward the ballroom together, I noticed employees smiling at me instead of looking away. Guests stepped aside with genuine courtesy. Even the musicians welcomed us with the opening notes of a new piece. The room had not changed. The people inside it had. And somehow, without demanding anything for himself, Adrian Moretti had reminded every person there that dignity could be restored just as quietly as it could be taken away. The rest of the evening passed in a way I never could have imagined when I first stepped into the ballroom carrying a silver tray. The same guests who had barely noticed me before now thanked me by name as I served coffee and dessert. Conversations that had once felt intimidating became surprisingly warm. My manager checked on me twice, not because he doubted my work, but because he genuinely wanted to know whether I was doing all right. It was a small change, yet it felt enormous. Respect had quietly replaced indifference. Every now and then I caught sight of Adrian across the ballroom. He never tried to draw attention to himself. He greeted donors, listened more than he spoke, and somehow managed to make every person feel that their words mattered. Watching him from a distance, I realized that the greatest authority in the room did not come from wealth or reputation. It came from the ability to make other people feel seen. Near midnight, the final guests began collecting their coats. The quartet played one last piece before carefully packing away their instruments. Event staff finally allowed themselves to smile with the relief that comes after a long shift ends successfully. I carried my empty tray back to the service station and untied my apron, feeling exhaustion settle into my shoulders. When I stepped outside the hotel, cool autumn air greeted me, carrying the familiar sounds of Manhattan after dark. Yellow taxis rolled past in steady streams, their headlights reflecting across rain-polished streets. I wrapped my light jacket tighter around myself and started walking toward the subway entrance 2 blocks away. Miss Carter. I turned at the sound of my name. Adrian stood a few steps behind me, no security surrounding him, no audience watching. Just one man standing beneath the warm glow of the hotel entrance lights. He held out the cream-colored envelope I had accidentally left on the reception lounge table. "You forgot this," he said. I accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you. I seem to have forgotten a lot of things tonight." A quiet laugh escaped him. "Perhaps you remembered the important ones instead." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment while the city moved around us. Finally, I looked at him. "I still do not understand why everything happened the way it did." Adrian glanced toward the traffic before answering. "Neither do I. Life rarely explains itself in the moment." He paused, then added, "But I have learned that kindness has a remarkable way of finding its way home." Those words settled gently into my heart. They reminded me of the bowl of soup I had bought years earlier without expecting anything in return. They reminded me that dignity costs nothing to give, yet it can change the course of another person's life. A black sedan quietly pulled to the curb. Adrian opened the rear door but did not step inside immediately. "Miss Carter," he said, "the scholarship applications for the Moretti Foundation open next month. If you are still planning to finish your degree, I hope you will apply." I stared at him in surprise. "Will you make sure I receive one?" He smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from him all evening. "No, you have already earned the opportunity. The decision will belong to the committee, exactly as it should." I thanked him, and this time the words felt far too small for everything that had happened. He gave a respectful nod before entering the car. As the sedan disappeared into the flow of Manhattan traffic, I looked down at the envelope in my hands, then up at the skyline stretching toward the night sky. I had walked into that gala believing invisible people were safer. I walked away understanding something entirely different. The world does not always change because powerful people speak the loudest. Sometimes it changes because one person quietly chooses to protect another's dignity, and someone else never forgets the kindness they were shown.